The day they expelled us from the agricultural college, the dean didn't even have the decency to stand up from his chair. He sat behind his mahogany desk with his hands folded and his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, and he looked at my sister Mara and me the way a man looks at something he has already decided to throw away. Like the decision had been made long before we walked through his door. Like this meeting was just the paperwork. "You understand why we cannot allow this to continue," he said. His name was Dean Harlow Prentice. He had been running the Crestfield Agricultural College for 22 years. His portrait hung in the main hall next to the portraits of 4 other deans, all of them with the same expression, the expression of men who had spent their careers deciding which ideas were acceptable and which were not. "We submitted peer-reviewed research," Mara said. Her voice was steady. It had always been steadier than mine. "Published methodology. 3 years of documented results. You submitted results that contradict every established principle of—" "The results don't contradict principles," I said. "They contradict assumptions. Those are different things." Prentice looked at me over his glasses. "Mr. Calloway, the soil regeneration data alone—" "Mr. Calloway," his voice sharpened, "I am going to ask you to listen carefully. What you and your sister have been doing in the research plots is not science, it is provocation. You have been undermining the confidence of other students in established agricultural methods. You have been actively disparaging the recommendations of faculty members with decades of experience. And you have been doing all of this while presenting yourselves as some kind of—" He waved his hand, searching for the word— "alternative authority." "We presented data," Mara said. "You presented a circus." The room went quiet. Through the window behind Prentice's head, I could see the research plots in the distance, the long rows of the college's experimental fields, straight and geometric, and sprayed within an inch of their lives with inputs that cost more than most of the local farmers made in a year. Beautiful from this distance. Sterile if you got close enough to look. I thought about our plots. I thought about what we had been growing there for 3 years, while everyone watched with polite disbelief that slowly curdled into something less polite. I thought about the soil test, the yields, the water retention numbers that didn't make sense until they did. "We are removing you from the program," Prentice said, "effective immediately. You will surrender your research plot access by end of business today. Your records will reflect academic dismissal." He paused. "I would strongly recommend against pursuing this line of work. The farming community in this region is a close one. Word travels." He meant it as a warning. I understood it as one. Mara picked up her bag. She stood. She looked at Prentice with an expression I recognized. Not anger. Something quieter. Something that had been there since we were children, watching our grandmother work the land in ways nobody else around us could understand. The expression of someone who has already decided. "Thank you for your time," she said. We walked out of his office and down the hall past the portraits of the 5 deans and out into the gray October morning. We stood on the front steps of Crestfield Agricultural College for the last time. Around us, students moved between buildings. A few of them looked at us. Some of them knew. Word, as Prentice had said, traveled. Mara turned up her collar against the wind. "Well," she said. "Well," I said. We had $73 between us, a decade's worth of notebooks, and a deed to 11 acres of land in the Halverson Valley that our grandmother had left us when she died the previous spring. 11 acres that everyone who had ever seen them described the same way with variations on a single theme. Played out, worn through, done. The land had been in our family for 4 generations. Our great-great-grandmother had broken it in the 1880s. Generation by generation, decade by decade, it had been farmed the way everyone farmed back then, the way the extension offices recommended, the way the agricultural colleges taught, the way the seed companies and the chemical companies and the equipment companies designed their products to support. And generation by generation, decade by decade, it had given back less. By the time our grandmother inherited it, the topsoil that had once been 18 inches deep was down to 4. The creek that had once run clear ran brown after every rain. The yields that had fed a family of 7 now barely justified the cost of inputs. The neighbors said it was just old land, tired land, land that had given everything it had. Our grandmother said something different. Her name was Vera Calloway. She had an 8th grade education, arthritic hands, and the most comprehensive self-taught understanding of soil biology I have ever encountered in 60 years of working the land. She had spent 30 years quietly reading everything she could find about the living systems beneath the surface of farms. She had taken correspondence courses. She had driven 4 hours each way to hear lectures at the state university. She had written letters, actual handwritten letters to researchers at agricultural experiment stations across the country, asking questions that the researchers themselves sometimes found embarrassing because they didn't know the answers. She had also, in the last 12 years of her life, been running an experiment on our family's 11 acres that nobody in the valley knew about or would have believed that they had. She had stopped tilling. She had stopped spraying. She had planted cover crop mixes so complex the seed suppliers thought she was joking. She had introduced livestock rotations that looked like chaos and functioned like clockwork. She had built compost systems that turned farm waste into something darker and richer than anything the land had produced in 100 years. She had let hedgerows grow along the field edges and then watched, methodically, scientifically, as the insect populations shifted and the bird populations followed, and the pest pressure on her crops dropped year by year without a single drop of pesticide. The valley had opinions about all of this. Play it out land, they said. Nothing to lose, letting it go wild. Old woman's lost her mind, said others. The banker who held the small mortgage on the property had come out twice to look at it and had left shaking his head. Miss Vera, he said the second time, I cannot in good conscience offer you any additional credit against land in this condition. The condition he was referring to was the fact that it didn't look like a farm. It looked, he said, like a place that had been abandoned and then reclaimed by weeds. He didn't know what weeds were for. Grandmother did. When she died, she left us the land, her notebooks, 40 years of them, filling 2 large crates, and a letter. The letter was 3 pages long in her careful, slanted handwriting, and it said many things, but the most important thing it said was this: the land is not worn out. The land is waiting. It has been waiting for someone to stop taking from it and start giving back. I have been giving back for 12 years, and I can see the change beginning. In the soil color, in the earthworm counts, in the way the creek runs clearer after rain than it did 10 years ago. I am running out of time to see the rest. That is what I am leaving you. Not a problem, a process already underway. Find out where it leads. We had spent 3 years trying to find out where it led in the research plots of Crestfield Agricultural College because we had believed, naively, we understood now, that a scientific institution would be interested in scientific results. We had been wrong about that. Now we stood on the college steps in the October wind, and we had $73, and we had the notebooks, and we had 11 acres that the valley called played out, and we had 3 years of data that a dean with a mahogany desk had just called a circus. He said word travels, Mara said. He meant it as a threat. I know. She picked up her bag. Let's go see what the land looks like. We drove to the valley in the old pickup that had been our grandmother's, with the notebooks in the bed under a tarp, and our combined belongings in 2 duffel bags, and the seed samples we had managed to take from the research plots before access was revoked in a cooler in the back seat. The valley was 3 hours east, and hill country, where the farms were old and the families were older, and everyone knew everyone and had known them for generations. We had grown up here, spent summers here with our grandmother, left at 18 to pursue the education that was supposed to make us more useful when we came back. We came back different than expected. The farm looked the way farms look when no one has been actively managing them for a year, but it also looked the way our grandmother had described, different from the farms around it, in ways that were hard to articulate until you spent time there. The neighboring fields were bare dirt in October, stripped down after harvest, flat and brown and perfectly geometric. Our fields were not bare. They were thick with cover crops that our grandmother had seeded the previous spring before she got sick. A mix of winter rye and hairy vetch and crimson clover and turnips and radishes. A dozen species growing together in a tangle that looked to untrained eyes like a mess and to trained eyes like a meal being prepared for the soil below. The soil below. That was the thing. Mara went to the corner of the first field and dug a hole with her hands. She dug down 6 inches and held the soil up. It was darker than the surrounding fields. It smelled different, rich and complex, like a forest floor rather than mineral dirt. And when she squeezed it, it held together and then crumbled apart in a way that good soil does, the way clay doesn't and sand doesn't, and something that has been biologically active for years and years does. She looked at me. Mara was right, she said. She was always right. Let's start mapping. We had no money to hire help. We had no equipment beyond what our grandmother had left, old but maintained, a small tractor, hand tools, a broadcast seeder. We had the notebooks, and we had what we had learned in 3 years of research that the college had just told us was worthless. The first winter was about understanding what our grandmother had built. We walked every inch of those 11 acres. We dug soil samples at 20-meter intervals and tested them in the small portable lab we had salvaged from the college equipment we were technically allowed to keep. We counted earthworms, a primitive measure but a real one. Healthy soil has earthworms. Dead soil doesn't. Our grandmother's fields had more earthworms per cubic foot than anything we had tested at Crestfield. We read her notebooks, all 40 years of them. Mara read them in order from the beginning. I read them from the end backward. We compared notes in the evenings by the wood stove, building a picture of what she had done and why, what had worked and what hadn't, what she had figured out through patient observation that the research literature was only just beginning to catch up to. She had not been doing what the college called sustainable agriculture. She had been doing something older and stranger and more sophisticated. She had been trying to understand the farm as a system, the way an ecosystem is a system, with relationships and feedbacks and a kind of logic that only becomes visible if you watch long enough and stop trying to control everything. The valley watched us that winter, watched us with the particular attention that small communities give to people who are doing something unusual on land that everyone has opinions about. The farm nearest to ours was owned by a man named Dale Pritchard, who had farmed conventionally his entire life and whose field abutted ours on the eastern side. Dale was 64 years old, slow-moving, and precise in everything he said. He came over in January, walking his fence line ostensibly, but arriving at the corner where his land met ours with the deliberate casualness of someone who had planned the route. He looked at our cover crops. He looked at us. "There's grandchildren," he said. "Yes, sir." "Heard you got thrown out of Crestfield." "That's accurate." Dale was quiet for a moment. He reached down and pulled a fistful of the cover crop mix and turned it in his hands. "What is all this?" Mara explained the species mix. Dale listened with his head tilted like a man hearing something in a language he almost speaks. "And this does what exactly?" "Feeds the soil over winter, fixes nitrogen, breaks up compaction with the radish roots, build organic matter when it winter kills." Dale dropped the plants. "Your grandmother did strange things with this land." "Yes." "Never saw the yield reports." "She wasn't optimizing for yield." Dale looked at her. "Then what was she optimizing for?" "Soil health, long-term productivity, the capacity of the land to keep producing without requiring increasing inputs to maintain output." Dale was quiet again for a longer time. "That a college theory or a field theory?" "Both," I said. "Or neither. It's what the land told her." He nodded slowly, as if this were a reasonable answer, which in the valley it was. Farmers here trusted the land's testimony more than most institutions. He walked his fence line back the way he had come without another word. He would come back. They always come back, the ones who are actually curious, as opposed to the ones who ask questions to confirm what they already believe. The people who were not curious were louder. The Halverson Valley had a farm bureau, as most valleys do, and the farm bureau had meetings, and at the meetings that winter, we were discussed. We knew this because the valley was small and because some of the people at those meetings were uncomfortable with what was being said and told us afterward. What was being said, in various formulations, came down to this. The Callaway kids were going to ruin their grandmother's land with their college nonsense. They'd been thrown out of Crestfield for good reason.
What they were doing was dangerous, not just to their own farm, but potentially to the neighbors, because the things they were proposing to do, the no-till, the cover crops, the reduction of synthetic inputs, these things were irresponsible. Without herbicides, their weeds would spread. Without fungicides, their plant diseases would spread. Without the inputs that kept modern agriculture functioning, the whole enterprise would collapse, and they'd have a derelict property in the middle of everyone else's working farms. A man named Glenn Forsyth, who farmed 400 acres on the valley's western side and served as the Bureau's vice president, was particularly vocal. He had been at the same meeting where our grandmother had once tried to present her observations about soil biological activity 20 years earlier, and he had been among those who laughed her out of the room. He came to the farm in February, not to talk, to inspect. He walked the fence line on the side where our fields bordered his rented land, and he looked at our cover crops with narrowed eyes, and he said, "I'm watching for weed pressure come spring. If your operation causes problems on my fields, we'll be having a different conversation." Mara looked at him. "What kinds of weeds are you concerned about?" He named several species. She explained, patiently, that each one he had named was either already present throughout the valley or was not compatible with the species we were growing. He listened with the expression of a man who is not listening. He walked away. She turned to me when he was gone. "He's going to keep watching." "Let him watch," I said. "I know," she said. "I just want to be ready when he finds nothing." Spring came. We planted. Not the way the valley planted, not rows of a single crop treated with pre-emergent herbicide, fertilized with synthetic nitrogen, managed toward a yield number. We planted in combinations, main crops with companion species, arranged to benefit each other, to confuse pest insects and attract beneficial ones, to share nutrients and water and light in ways that mimicked, as much as a managed system can, the logic of natural ecosystems. It looked chaotic. We knew it looked chaotic. We had expected the reactions. What we hadn't entirely anticipated was the speed of them.
By June, when our fields were lush and strange, tall and mixed and thick with life in ways that looked nothing like agriculture and everything like something else, the valley had formed its opinion, and its opinion was not subtle. Weed field was the polite version. Glenn Forsyth drove past on the county road twice a week and always slowed down at our section. The Farm Bureau put an item on their meeting agenda, concerns regarding potential agricultural abandonment at Callaway property. We were not invited to that meeting. The county extension agent, a man named Larry Purcell, who had been in the valley for 15 years, came for an official visit in July. He walked our fields with his clipboard and his careful professional neutrality, and he said things like, "interesting approach," and "certainly unconventional," in the tone of someone choosing diplomatic language for what they actually think. At the end of the visit, he sat on the porch and said, "I want to be honest with you. What you're doing here doesn't align with any recommendations I can support through my office. The liability questions alone." "We're not asking for your recommendations," Mara said, "or your support." "Then what are you asking for?" "Nothing yet," she said. "We're asking for nothing yet." Purcell left looking slightly unsettled, which I later came to understand was an accurate response to what he had seen, because what he had seen was something he didn't have the framework to evaluate. The fields were not failing. By August, it was clear to anyone paying careful attention, and we were paying careful attention, that the fields were doing something unusual. The yield per acre on our experimental sections was tracking higher than comparable conventional plots in the valley, despite zero synthetic fertilizer inputs. The water retention after the July dry spell was visibly different. Our fields stayed green for a week after the neighboring conventional plots started to stress. The pest pressure that Forsyth has predicted had not materialized. Or rather, it had, but the predatory insect populations that our hedgerows and flower strips supported were managing it in a way that no spray program had ever managed it on this land before. And the soil tests. The soil tests were the thing we talked about in the evenings with something close to awe. Our grandmother had been at this for 12 years. We had been at it for less than one.
But the biological activity indicators, the fungal networks, the bacterial diversity, the aggregate stability, were accelerating in ways that her notebook data suggested would take another 3 or 4 years to reach. Either we had started from a higher baseline than expected, or the system was responding to something we were doing, or both. "We need to document everything," Mara said one evening in August. "Every test, every measurement, every date. If the yields come in the way I think they're going to come in, we're going to need documentation that nobody can argue with." Prentice said the data was a circus. Prentice isn't going to be the audience. She was already writing. The audience is going to be whoever needs to hear this next. The harvest came in. We processed the numbers.
The yields were real. Not miraculous, we weren't claiming miracles, but real and significant. Per-acre productivity that exceeded valley averages on key crops, achieved without synthetic nitrogen, without herbicide, without pesticide, without any of the expensive inputs that had been consuming most of the margin from valley farms for decades. The economic numbers were what startled us most, because the yield advantage was real but modest. What was not modest was the input cost differential. We had spent, in our first full season, roughly 30% of what the average valley farmer spent per acre on inputs. The margin per acre, even with our slightly lower yields on some crops, was nearly double what conventional farming in the valley was producing. Mara put the spreadsheet in front of me and said nothing for a moment. "This isn't sustainable," I said. "What?" "I mean, conventionally, their system. These input costs, these margins, the farms in this valley are mostly not making money. We knew that. Everyone knows that. But when you put it next to this—" "I know," she said. "They're going to hate us for this. They're already doing that. They're going to hate us more." She closed the spreadsheet. "Or," she said, "they're going to need us." She was right, but it took 2 more years for the need to become undeniable. The second and third years were about deepening. We expanded the composting systems, developing a processing capacity that could handle our own farm waste and, as we quietly discovered there was demand, the waste streams from neighboring farms, manure, crop residue, the material that conventional farms paid to dispose of, and that we understood as an input. We expanded the seed-saving operation. Our grandmother had been saving and selecting seed for 30 years, choosing year by year for adaptation to local conditions, for disease resistance, for flavor and nutrition, and the particular tolerance for the valley's clay soils and unpredictable springs. The seed she had accumulated was, we came to understand, extraordinary, not because it was exotic, but because it was local, because it had been shaped by this specific place for 3 decades. We began multiplying it. We also began attracting visitors, which surprised us because we had not invited anyone and had not advertised anything. They found us the way curious people find things, through the kind of informal network that connects people who are quietly asking the same questions. A young farmer from the next county who had been trying to reduce his input costs and couldn't understand why his yields didn't improve when he stopped tilling. A woman who was converting her family's vegetable operation to organic certification and wanted to understand how to manage soil biology. 2 agricultural students from the state university who had read something in a paper that referenced our methodology and tracked us down with the slightly embarrassed enthusiasm of people who aren't sure they're supposed to be where they are. We talked to all of them. We showed them the fields, the notebooks, the soil tests, the yield data. We explained what our grandmother had done and what we were building on top of it. They left and came back. They brought other people. The valley noticed this. The valley was not pleased. Glenn Forsyth at the November Farm Bureau meeting characterized our farm as some kind of cult operation where they bring people out to look at weeds. The room, from what we heard, found this amusing. Dale Pritchard, who had been coming by regularly by then and asking increasingly specific questions about cover crop timing, did not find it amusing, and said so, which made things slightly more complicated for everyone. We did not attend the Farm Bureau meetings. We were not members, and we were not invited. What we did instead was work and document and build. In the third year, the soil test came back with numbers that stopped us both. We had been testing a specific field, the worst field,
the one that had been most severely depleted, the one our grandmother's notes described as the field I am least sure about, the one that may take the longest, and testing it every 6 months, the way you'd monitor a patient recovering from a serious illness. The topsoil depth had increased by a ½ inch. This sounds trivial. It is not. Conventional agriculture loses topsoil. It does not gain it, or gains it in geological time, centuries per inch. We had gained a ½ inch in 3 years on the worst field. The model our grandmother had been using, the one she had developed from first principles to do 40 years of observation, predicted this was possible. Nobody at Crestfield had believed it was possible. Prentice had specifically called this claim the most irresponsible piece of pseudoscience in our submission. Mara looked at the result for a long time. "We need an independent verification," she said. We reached out to a soil scientist at the State University, a woman named Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had been quietly following the emerging research on soil biological systems, and who, unlike most of her colleagues, did not have a stake in the conventional paradigms being correct. We explained who we were, what we had, and what we were asking. We offered her full access, every test, every notebook, every field, in exchange for independent verification of our methodology and results. She came the following spring. She spent 4 days on the farm. She dug holes, she took samples, she sat with our grandmother's notebooks and read them with the focused absorption of a researcher recognizing something real. On the last evening, she sat at the kitchen table and looked at us across a spread of test results and said, "Your grandmother was doing legitimate science." "We know," Mara said. "You understand what this data represents?" "We think so. She touched the topsoil accumulation results. "If this is replicated under controlled conditions, this overturns 30 years of consensus about the timeline for soil restoration in degraded agricultural land." She paused. "There are people who are not going to want this to be true." "We know those people," I said. She smiled slightly. "Crestfield, yes, I heard." She looked at the notebooks again. "Your grandmother should have been published." She tried. She wrote to research stations, she asked questions. She was a woman with an 8th grade education farming played-out land in a valley nobody had heard of. Nobody was interested. Vasquez nodded slowly. "I'm interested now," she said. "If you're willing, I'd like to design a formal study. Use your farm as a primary site. Document this rigorously enough that nobody can dismiss it." We were willing. The study took 18 months and was published in a peer-reviewed soil science journal that Dean Prentice's department subscribed to. Mara sent him a copy with a brief note that said only, "For your reference." We never heard back. The summer the paper was published was the summer the valley situation became impossible to ignore. It had been building for years. Input costs, fertilizer, herbicide, pesticide, fuel had been rising steadily, pushed by supply chain pressures and market forces, and the simple economic logic of industries that know they have captive customers. Crop prices had not risen proportionally. The margins that were already thin had become, for many valley farms, non-existent or negative. Glenn Forsyth's 400 acres had been operating at a loss for 2 consecutive years. His lease agreements with 3 separate landowners were under renegotiation. 2 of those landowners had called us separately to ask about alternative management approaches. The Halverson Valley Farm Bureau held an emergency meeting in July. We were not invited. We heard about it from Dale Pritchard, who had been attending the meetings for 30 years, and who came by the following morning with a kind of careful urgency. "There's a crisis," he said. He was standing at the edge of our first field, where the summer crops were at their most lush, and he was looking at them with the expression of a man who has spent a long time not seeing something and is suddenly seeing it. "How bad?" Mara asked. 7 farms in this valley are going to lose their operations by spring if something doesn't change," he said. "Not all of them are as bad as Forsyth, but most of them can't survive another season at current input costs and current prices." He paused. "They had a conversation last night about what options exist." "And?" Dale looked at us. He was a man who didn't say things he wasn't sure of, which was one of the reasons we had come to trust him. "Someone mentioned your operation," he said. "The paper, the results." "What was the response?" "Some of them said words I won't repeat in mixed company," he said. "But some of them asked questions, real questions, about the methodology,
about the transition costs, about whether it was possible to do what you've done without 3 years of, he paused, choosing the word carefully, philosophy. We understood what he meant. Our approach was not a set of practices you could drop onto a conventional farm and expect to work immediately. It was a system, and systems required understanding, and understanding required a shift in how you thought about what a farm was and what it was for. That shift was the part the Valley was resistant to, not the techniques themselves, but the world view behind them. There are faster pathways, Mara said. For farms in immediate crisis, there are transition approaches that can improve margins in a single season without full conversion. It's not what we're doing, but it's a start. Would you be willing to present to the Bureau? We looked at each other. Will they listen? I asked. Dale considered. Some of them, the ones whose backs are against a wall. He paused. Glenn Forsyth is going to be the hardest. He usually is, Mara said. We presented to the Farm Bureau in August. We had prepared for 3 weeks, not for the content, we knew the content, but for the presentation, for the translation of what we knew into language that would land with people who had been farming conventionally their whole lives, who felt challenged by the implication that what they had been doing was wrong, who were scared and proud and tired, which is a combination of things that makes people very difficult to reach. Mara opened. She talked about our grandmother. She talked about the notebooks. She talked about the fact that Vera Calloway had sat in this same room 20 years earlier and tried to share what she was learning and had been dismissed, and had gone home and kept working anyway, and that what she had built in the years that followed was the foundation of what we had. She wasn't trying to tell you that you were wrong. She was trying to share something she had found. She didn't have the vocabulary for it yet, and neither did the science. The science is catching up now. We have data that has been peer-reviewed and published that validates what she spent 40 years observing. She paused. We're not here to tell you that you've been doing it wrong. We're here to tell you that there is another way, and that we've been doing it in this valley, on this land, and these are the results. I presented the numbers. The room was quiet while I went through them. Not the quiet of acceptance, the quiet of a room full of people doing arithmetic. When I finished, Glenn Forsyth spoke. He was sitting in the second row with his arms crossed, and he had the expression of a man who has decided not to be convinced, but is finding it harder than expected. Those are your numbers, he said. They've been independently verified, I said, by Dr. Elena Vasquez at the State University. The verification process and methodology are published. You can read the paper. You expect me to believe that a farm run the way yours is run outperforms conventional production. Not in every metric in every season, Mara said. We've never claimed that. We've claimed that the total economic picture, inputs, outputs, margin, and long-term soil trajectory is significantly more favorable. And we've shown that with 3 years of data. Your grandmother had 40 years of data, said Dale Pritchard from the back of the room. And she was right. Forsyth looked at him. Something shifted in the room. What would a transition look like? Asked a woman named Martha Hensley, who farmed 80 acres on the valley's south side, and whose expression was not hostile, but rather the particular focused attention of someone calculating survival. Not a full transition, a start. Mara walked to the board. She began to write. The transition was not fast. Transitions are never fast. This is one of the things the Valley had to learn, and it was the thing that required the most patience from us and from the farmers who came to us in the years that followed. We set up a consultation program the following spring. Farmers who wanted help redesigning their operations came to the farm, walked the fields, sat with the notebooks, learned the principles. We charged for our time. Not a lot, but enough to sustain the operation. We developed training materials based on our grandmother's records and our own experience. We connected farmers with seed from our supply, with composting support, with the network of others who were making the same journey. Some of them came because they were desperate. Some of them came because they were curious. Some of them came because Dale Pritchard or Martha Hensley told them to come. A few of them came because their children had read the published paper and shown it to them. Glenn Forsyth came on a Tuesday morning in October, 3 years after the Bureau meeting. He arrived without calling ahead, which was unusual for him. He stood at the gate for a moment looking at the fields, and then he came to find us in the seed-saving barn. He did not say hello. He said, "I need help." The 400 acres had been consolidated. He had lost two of his lease arrangements, reduced to 260 acres he actually owned. He had spent the last 2 years trying incremental changes, reducing some inputs, trying a cover crop mix he bought without fully understanding. The results had been mixed. He was running out of time and money, and I thought, looking at him, something else. The confidence that had always characterized him, the certainty that he knew how farming was done had eroded. He was 67 years old. He had farmed for 45 years, and he was standing in our barn asking for help. Mara looked at him for a moment. I don't know what she was feeling. I know what I was feeling. Something complicated, something that had old anger and new understanding braided together. And underneath both of them, something that felt like recognition. He was standing where we had stood, in the room where Prentiff had told us our work was a circus. He was standing where our grandmother had stood in the Farm Bureau meeting 20 years ago. "Sit down," Mara said. "Let's start from the beginning." The valley changed over the years that followed. Not all at once, not uniformly, not without setbacks. Transitions are messy. There were farms that tried and failed, not because the approach was wrong, but because the timing was wrong, or the resources were insufficient, or the knowledge transfer happened too slowly. There were seasons of drought and seasons of flood, and some of the newly transitioning farms struggled more than they would have in their old systems, at least initially, because resilience is built over time, and the biological systems take years to fully establish. But the valley changed. 11 farms had formally adopted significant elements of our approach within 5 years of the Bureau presentation. 14 more had implemented partial changes. The Farm Bureau itself, under new leadership, Martha Hensley became president, began hosting educational sessions that drew farmers from 3 neighboring counties. Dr. Vasquez brought her graduate students to the farm for fieldwork every spring. Our farm had become, without our designing it this way, a teaching site, a demonstration, a living argument. And the soil. The soil was the thing that we came back to, always, as the measure of what was real. Because soil is slow. Soil is honest. Soil does not respond to argument or politics or academic dismissal or Farm Bureau votes. Soil responds to what you actually do over the actual years. The worst field, the field our grandmother had been least sure about, now had a topsoil depth of nearly 7 inches. When she had begun her work, it had been under 3. In 25 years of her work and then ours, the field that everyone in the valley had called played out had built 4 inches of topsoil that would, if we and whoever came after us maintained the system, keep building. 4 inches of topsoil. In a world that is losing topsoil at catastrophic rates, on land that everyone had written off. We held an open day in September of that year, the 25th anniversary of our grandmother's death, which was also, we had calculated, roughly the anniversary of when she had made the decision to change her approach to the land. We opened the farm to anyone who wanted to come. We set up stations in each field. We spread the notebooks, all 40 years of them, plus our own 12, on tables under a canopy and invited people to read. About 200 people came. Farmers from the valley and from the neighboring counties, students, 2 journalists, a delegation from the State Agricultural Extension Office that included, somewhat to our astonishment, Larry Purcell, now retired, who walked the fields in silence for most of the day and then found Mara near the creek and said, "I was wrong about what I could and couldn't endorse. I was working from a framework that didn't have room for what your grandmother was doing, and I let that framework make decisions that I should have made myself." He was in his 70s. It takes some people a long time. "You came today," she said. "That counts." Glenn Forsyth was there. He had been farming with our support for 3 years by then, and his 260 acres were profitable for the first time in a decade. He was still Glenn Forsyth, still precise, still slow to speak, still carrying the particular gravity of a man who has spent his life being certain and is still adjusting to uncertainty. But he found me at the edge of the compost demonstration area, and he said, without preamble, "I need you to know something. All right? I was in that room when your grandmother presented, 20 years ago." He looked at his hands. I didn't laugh, but I didn't stop the laughing either. I sat there and let it happen because she was saying something that made me uncomfortable, and it was easier to let the room decide she was wrong than to think about whether she might be right. He looked up. "She was right," he said, "and I wasted 20 years of land that didn't have 20 years to waste." He paused. "I am sorry. For her. And for what my silence meant when you two showed up with her work. I knew better, and I let it happen again." I thought about the right thing to say. I thought about our grandmother, who had never been vindicated in her lifetime, who had sat in that room and been laughed at and gone home and kept working because the land didn't care about the laughter, and neither, finally, did she. "She would have just handed you a notebook," I said. Forsyth looked at me. "She would have said, 'Here, look at this. Look at what I found.' She wouldn't have wanted the apology. She would have wanted you to keep working." He nodded slowly. "I am," he said. "I will." I want to tell you something about what we lost, because the story is not only about what we found. We lost years. We lost the years we spent at Crestfield building towards something that was taken from us in a single meeting. We lost the credibility that an institutional credential would have given us, the ability to walk into conversations without first having to prove we had a right to be in them. We lost the ease of being believed, which is a thing you don't know you have until it's gone. We lost, in a smaller way, some of what it might have felt like to be young. The first years on the ridge, the surviving years, the years of $73 and 2 duffel bags, and a valley that was watching for us to fail, were years that hardened us in ways that perhaps we didn't need to be hardened. Mara says she wouldn't trade them. I say the same. But we say it the way people say things they've accepted rather than things they've chosen. And we lost a chance to know our grandmother as adults, as equals, as people who could have told her, "We see what you were doing. We understand it. You were right." She died without any of that, and that is the grief that doesn't change shape the way the other griefs do. But here is what we didn't lose. We didn't lose the land. We didn't lose the notebooks. We didn't lose the 40 years of work she had built into the soil itself, invisible and patient and real in the way that living systems are real. We didn't lose each other, Mara and I, which seems like it should go without saying, but doesn't, because the years we are talking about were the kind of years that test things, and some things don't survive testing, and we did. And we didn't lose the knowledge. This is a thing I come back to, always, at the end. They can dismiss your methodology. They can revoke your plot access. They can schedule emergency Farm Bureau meetings about the weed situation on your property. They can call you names and spread rumors and make it socially expensive to be associated with you. They can do all of that, and they did. But they cannot unknow what you know. And they cannot untell the soil what it has been told by years of careful attention. And they cannot take back the water that flows from a hillside once someone has found it. The knowledge was always ours. The land was always waiting for someone who understood it. All we had to do, all our grandmother had done, and all we did after her, was keep working, keep watching, keep building what we believed in, while the people who didn't believe stood at the fence line and watched for problems. The farm is 31 acres now. We bought 20 additional acres from a neighbor who was exiting farming, land that had been conventionally farmed for 60 years and was, when we took it on, in the state that our grandmother's original fields had been in when she started. We are 12 years into its restoration. The soil tests are beginning to look the way the original fields tests looked at year 8. The system is building. Mara runs the consultation program and the seed library, which now holds 240 locally adapted varieties that our grandmother started selecting and we have continued. I run the fields and the composting operation. We have 2 people who work with us full-time and several who come seasonally, young people mostly, curious people, the kind who have heard something that made them wonder whether there might be another way and have come to see for themselves. We have never once turned anyone away who came to learn. This was not a policy we decided on. It was something we understood, standing in our grandmother's fields in the October wind with $73 and 2 crates of notebooks, that the knowledge was not ours to hoard, that it had been gathered by a woman who was trying to give something back to land that had given everything, and that the giving was the point. Dean Prentice retired from Crestfield 4 years after he expelled us. His retirement announcement was circulated with extensive praise for his 26 years of leadership. We read it. We said nothing. The peer-reviewed paper that documented our results, the one Dr. Vasquez helped us publish, has been cited 217 times in the soil science literature as of this writing. Some of those citations are from Crestfield researchers. None of them mention where the work originated. We said nothing about that either. There is a quote on the wall of our seed library. We didn't choose it for philosophical reasons. We found it in our grandmother's notebook, in the margins of her entry for September 14th, in the year she turned 60, and it seemed right for the wall. She had written it without attribution. We don't know if she read it somewhere or wrote it herself. It says, "They will tell you the ground is spent. Dig your hands in anyway. Life knows where it is." The spring is still flowing. Down in the valley that our grandmother's neighbors called worthless, the soil is still building, slow and honest in the way that real things build. The seed library grows each year. The notebooks fill. The curious people keep coming. And the valley, the same valley that called us colt farmers and weed growers and expelled students with college nonsense, sends its children to learn here now. Some of them are the grandchildren of the people who watched us struggle through those first winters, who sat in the bureau meetings and used words their daughters had to explain to their daughters. Those children come and dig their hands into the soil and ask why it's different from what they've seen elsewhere. And we tell them about the 40 years of work that came before us, and the woman who did it alone, without institutional support or credentials or the respect of her neighbors, because she had understood something that the land was trying to show her, and she was not willing to look away. What they told us was worthless, they simply hadn't looked beneath. What they called a weed field was a system learning to heal itself. What they called academic dismissal, we called a beginning. You will be told that the ground is spent, that your inheritance is nothing, that the work you're doing makes no sense to people who've decided they already know what the land can do. Dig your hands in anyway. The knowledge is already there. It has been accumulating, patient and real in every year of careful work that came before you. The only question is whether you're willing to find it. We were, our grandmother was, and the soil remembers everything.